Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about the basics of company formation with Starlyn Priest, who is an entrepreneur in residence at the Veale Institute here at Case Western Reserve University. And she's also a graduate of our School of Law as well. So from here, I'll let Starlyn take it. And if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. And we want this to also be conversational as well. So, please don't hesitate to ask any questions that you have. And thank you so much, Starlyn.
Thank you so much, Doug, for introducing me. Thank you to all those that are attending here. Hopefully I've brought some festive energy with my attire here. Again, my name is Starlyn Priest, and today I will be discussing some of the basics of company formation. And so, as Doug said, please feel free to post your questions, as we go along. So to start off, just to give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering in this presentation deck. First, I'll do a little bit of background on myself. Then we will move to talk about some of the things that you want to consider in advance of launching your startup. So there's some work that needs to be done before you actually form the company. Then we'll get down into the details of, what forming the company involves, looking at company formation checklist, what are some of the items that you need to complete in that process, and then what are the benefits of establishing a legal entity. And then we'll get down into some specifics. I do keep it very high level just because we're appealing to a legal audience. And really, we just want some of the practicalities of company formation. So we talk about 6 different categories, or I should say 5 different categories, but there's some subcategories of partnership, but sole proprietorship, limited liability company, C corporations, S corporations, and then general partnerships, and also a limited partnership and limited liability partnerships as well. And then I will share with you some of the administrative filing processes, what's actually involved in, the act of filing the documents that are needed in order to form those entities. And then really quickly at the end, I will make mention of the resources that CASE has. CASE actually has a very strong entrepreneurship ecosystem, and we're working through the Veale Institute and working in partnership with some of the other organizations to get the word out there about the support that entrepreneurs have, faculty, students, alumni, so just generally the support. So a little bit about myself. As Doug mentioned, I'm an entrepreneur in residence at CASE, went to Case Western Law School. Also have a master's in business from Cleveland State University and a background in business economics from the College of Worcester. Prior to going to law school, I worked in management consulting. So I actually consulted with a lot of different industries. I do list some of those industries below. So a lot of different experience, both in the business world and in the legal hemisphere. So hopefully that experience can be valuable in having this conversation today. So we kind of start at the beginning. You and your team have an idea for a startup. Maybe it's a project that you've been working on, or maybe it's just you're in the brainstorming stage of a company idea. What are some of the things that you need to do in advance of forming an actual company? So some of these pre-launch considerations would be, so at this point, if you're thinking about starting a company, you should have identified a problem for which you have a solution. I start there, and it might seem basic for some, just because really when you're thinking about building out your company, it needs to solve a problem. You need to make sure that there's actually market potential for the business. Sometimes people, rush to the place where we're starting, go get an LLC. You might hear a lot of, noise out there about, get an LLC, but you really want to make sure that you're being thoughtful in advance about, what problem is your company actually solving. Conducting a very thorough market research. So are you looking at your competitors? I can tell you, in my experience, I've had tons of, when working with startup companies, some startup companies say, there's no one out there that has this, or there's no one out there that's competing. And so as we all, should know, and hopefully at the end of this presentation, you would know, that's likely untrue. Very few startups are complete and total creations of new innovations. Normally there's incremental changes that you build a business around, but definitely, you want to make sure you're doing your market research to, identify those potential competitors, understand your customers. Who are you selling to? Who's different from who your competitors are selling to, or the same? You also, in those beginning stages, want to identify your internal talent gaps. So maybe you have this idea, maybe you do have a team, but maybe you may not have all of the talent needed to move this forward. So you want to think about those things even in advance of starting a company to really gain some understanding of, what's missing. Another pre-launch to-do list item would be talking to subject matter experts and just conducting even more research. After you think you've researched, research some more. So having conversations with industry subject matter experts, if you can, and really using that information to then, for the next item, develop and refine your product service offerings. So one of the things that's incredibly important is to really understand, what are you offering? What is different? What is unique? Is it a process? Is it a new way of doing something? Is it a product? You really want to understand kind of the details enough to be able to have a conversation about what your company is doing. Now, the next item that's on here may not apply for, say, services companies. Some services companies may not necessarily have a minimally viable products, but if you are, say, maybe a software as a service company, you might have, or maybe it's an app that you're developing. You might want to have just that basics before you want to start those conversations with potential investors, so to speak. Another item on that list would be to begin assessing early customer acquisition. So your beta users, who is going to buy, testing out the market to see, what do their price points look like? What do their price points look like? What are their, willingness to pay? So you can gain some insight, and we have the wonderful tools of, social media and all these other different tools out there online where you can get access to groups of people. So you definitely want to leverage that even before moving to the stage of formalizing a company. Another item that's on this list here is, seek resources to assist in determining whether your product or service is novel. So I can tell you in my experience from working with startup companies when I was with the IP Venture Clinic at CASE, I would have newbies come in, new founders, and, they have an idea, and, maybe they think that idea is novel in some way, that they could pursue a patent. Well, obviously patentability analysis and just the world of patentability is very nuanced. It's very technical. That's why I always encourage people, if you do believe that you have something novel, you need to secure some relationship with an attorney that can guide you through that process. And that can also, assess whether or not, conduct a patentability analysis and assess whether or not there is some with your invention. The last item that I placed on the list here is check for potential issues with federally registered trademarks and also your state registered marks as well. So those are not the same thing. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on down in the presentation as being an item you want to take care of. So, so here we have some things that even before you formalize the company or move forward on that process, you want to consider. All right. So, everybody wants to raise capital when they want to start a company, they want to raise capital. Obviously, there are a number of different sources of capital that can be raised. Now, this presentation will not necessarily dive down into each one of these buckets and how to seek out support, but it is something to begin thinking about how your business or what type of business would be suitable for different types of funders. So each one of these funders, say a lending institution, so you have your banks, right? Or even alternative lending institutions. Those institutions are going to look for different things when it comes to determining whether or not they're going to fund your venture. Friends and family, not everyone has that option, but if you do have friends and family, they might have a different conversation with you when they're determining whether or not to support you. Angel investors and venture capital funding sources are also different. Again, this presentation won't dive down into the nuances of that, but these are some of the things you want to think about. So say, for example, if you have a tech-based company, maybe your tech-based company would be suitable for a venture fund conversation at some point in the future. But just getting you to think about how your business, what types of funding sources, if you're looking to raise funding, would be suitable for the type of business you have. The last item on the list there is non-financial support. A lot of times I found in my experience that, in working with startup companies, they underestimate the value of having non-financial support. So maybe it is your subject matter experts that can be your informal board of advisors. So that's something that's also really important to consider in advance as well. Additional factors to consider: do you have the right team? Again, will you have investors? Will you hire consultants or other technical expertise? Insurance coverage, relationships with financial institutions, relationship with legal counsel. Of course, I'm going to promote that as being an extremely important part of your startup process. You want to make sure that you have your team in place in advance of the mistakes that can cost money later. Lastly, a relationship with a certified tax professional or accountant is also, some of the things that you want to be thinking about. So I mentioned earlier that before you launch, you want to check the availability of your company name. So you want to look at just generally high level. Now, you wouldn't necessarily have to say right from the very beginning, hire an attorney to do this part, but to really dig down and to get into the level of specificity that you really should need, it would be wise to do so. So you have your USPTO, and I can click on this and take you to that page here. Actually, what I'll do is just kind of show you a general. Okay, looks like it's not allowing me to do that, but maybe, here we go. All right, so yeah, USPTO office. This is the government site for where you can get some information, do some general searches. The Trademark electronic system allows you to do some general searches around, company name, maybe search the marks. But again, if you're not an attorney, you don't necessarily have, all of the knowledge to be able to do the proper search and conclude whether or not your mark or your company name would infringe on another federally registered mark. I'm going to hop back over here to the presentation. Sorry, guys. All right. Another place where you want to check in advance of seeking to register your company would be under state law. So the Ohio Secretary of State, and we'll talk a lot about that. That is where, when you're going through the process of creating that entity, it will ask you to do a search. So you will actually be prompted to do a search to check whether or not your company name is already registered with the state. Now, if you register your company name with the state, that does not give you federal protection, but you definitely want to have a conversation with your legal counsel to explore, what protections are necessary and to make sure that you are you're not infringing on anyone else's mark. So this just gives you an example from the federal Federal Registry of Trademarks. For Procter & Gamble, of course, you can imagine they have an endless amount of protected trademarks. I chose Febreze. I'm a fan of Febreze. So I chose that as, just an example. Again, this presentation won't dive down into intellectual property, but again, just to get you to think about, how to do some of these searches in advance. So on the state website, as I mentioned, you can also do those searches. Here's an example of the Ohio State University and their registration for their marks. So you'll see here, hopefully it's a bit clear. Please let me know if you can't see that, but you can see that the Ohio State University has a number of different registered marks with the state as well. All right, so getting to the crux of why we're here, forming the company. So there's a few items here that I've identified for you as, kind of a company formation checklist. You may have heard, or you will hear today, you need to have what's called an employer identification number. You can apply from that, right online. I did include some links for you. We will be sending out the presentation at the end if you'd like. So those links are readily available. But you want to go to the IRS website. They have where you can apply for free for an EIN number. So that's one thing. Of course, registering your company with the state. So going through that process, we'll discuss that in depth. And you want to establish a business bank account. So when you go to actually establish a bank account, they're going to ask you for some documentation that you're going to get once you have completed those first two items. The first thing is going to be your EIN number. They need that. And then they're also going to need a copy of your articles of organization or articles of incorporation, depending on the type of entity that you have created. Some of the other items here on the company formation checklist, partner agreements. So if you have more than one, if it's not just yourself in the business, you want to make sure that you're working with your counsel to develop partner agreements. If you are operating under a limited liability company, an LLC, as it's often called, you want to make sure that you are working with your attorney to draft the operating agreement. We'll talk a little bit about what's in that agreement as well, agreements. And then also employment agreements. So we don't dig down into the details on that, but these are some of the agreements that, in those beginning stages are incredibly important to your startup phase. Okay, so what are the benefits of establishing a legal entity? So if you are just a one-man shop, let's say you want to start a business and you're washing cars. A lot of people start at this stage, depending on the type of business you have, as a sole proprietor. So it's just you by yourself and you are making money doing whatever it is or selling doing whatever it is, whether it's a service or selling a product. A lot of people start there. But there does need to be a point where you question, well, when is the best time to establish an entity? So some of the trigger points, as I identify here, would be when you start to face the risk of liability. Now, if you're talking to, your legal counsel, they're going to say, really early, let's make sure everything is in place right from the very beginning. Tax benefits. So there's tax benefits to creating an entity, a legal entity as well. And then they're, in the process of wanting to garner interest in your company, when you're prepared to start raising investment funding, investors are going to have a preference, an actual entity. So maybe you could probably get some support from friends and family at that informal stage where you're sole proprietor, but for the most part, you're going to get the best results when wanting to seek funding when you have an actual entity that's been created. So the conversation about which entity is best for my business. As I continue to share, you want to work with your attorney to make sure that you are, having those conversations about what entity makes sense. Not all entities need to be a corporation from the very beginning, and some can. It really just depends on what type of business you are starting. So I've identified here a list of the different entity types that we're going to discuss. One is the sole proprietorship, as I shared. So, the sole proprietorship is someone who owns an unincorporated business by himself, by herself. So as I mentioned, if you wanted to say wash cars and it's just you going out and just providing that, you got a bucket and a sponge and you're going out and you're washing cars, if that's what you're doing. It's just you yourself. Then you have your corporation. So your C corporation, or C Corp as you may hear it be called, is a legal structure for a corporation where the owners, the shareholders are all taxed separately from the actual entity. We'll talk about the benefits to that in just a moment here. Now, limited liability. The limited liability entity is an entity that actually allows you to get a little bit of the benefits of the, corporation, a little bit of benefits of S corporation. So it's kind of like a hybrid. And you'll hear LLC or limited liability companies being used a lot because of a number of reasons that I will actually share a little bit further in the presentation. S corporations are corporations that elect to pass corporate income losses, deductions, and credits through their shareholders for federal tax purposes. A whole bunch of lingo. We'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means and what that looks like later. The last entity that we'll cover is a big category, which is partnerships. And partnerships there's 3 different categories of partnerships that I have identify in the presentation. So there's general partnerships, there's limited partnerships, and then limited liability partnerships. Each one of those categories has their own nuanced characteristics, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So sole proprietorship, as we mentioned, it's an unincorporated entity. Let me just move this over here. So what I'm going to do, my apologies here. I'm just moving a couple of things around my screen. There we go. There we go. So a couple of advantages and disadvantages around sole proprietorship. So as I mentioned, it's low barriers to entry. So you can start a sole proprietorship, you can get your bucket and your sponge, and you can go out and say, hey, I'm going to wash cars for my business. It's simple and it's affordable. Really, one of the benefits is that there's operating freedom. There's no formalities. There's no one that you have to report to. There's not a whole lot of record keeping that is required by law as a formal process. There's no filing requirements. The disadvantage to a sole proprietorship, though, is that there's really unlimited liability. So there's no separation between yourself as the owner and the business. So that means that you are personally liable for anything that transpires with that business. So not as attractive when you're thinking about, maybe the business that you're in might have certain types of liability that you want to go. If your personal assets from a sole proprietorship is definitely not going to be the best in those scenarios, but you want to make sure that you're working with your legal counsel to make those decisions. Lastly, or the last 2 here, challenges raising investment funding. As I mentioned, except for friends and family, you're probably going to have a challenge here because most companies want a formal entity, and so that they can also take advantage of the benefits that are offered to them by investing in companies. Now, also, sole proprietorships often lead to difficulty in maintaining financial control. So a lot of times with sole proprietorships, the founders, the owners don't tend to necessarily have very strong, rigid bookkeeping practices. And so that tends to make things a little financially difficult to track, which is another reason why it would be difficult for an investor or funder to want to invest in your company. So the next entity is a limited liability company. Many of you have probably already, heard about limited liability companies. If you have not, then I'll share, a bit further, here in this presentation. But a limited liability company is a business structure that's allowed by state statute. So definitely, I'm not sure where all the individuals in the audience are from, but you definitely want to work with your attorney in your state to help understand what those rules are around limited liability companies and what they require from their owners. I'm going to move this to the side here. All All right, so formation documents. So there are a couple of major documents that are required for to form a limited liability company. The biggest one that you will hear about are the Articles of Organization. The Articles of Organization's document is the document that is created when you go online and actually file. Back in the day, old days, like pre-internet or even early, I'd say even it's been a few years now since the Ohio Secretary of State has had everything online. But before, you used to have to physically go, download, print off the forms and, fill it out by hand. But now everything is electronic. Still have to pay a fee, but everything is electronic. So these Articles of Organization is the it's your constitution of the company. So it's got to include your name of the company. It has to include the words limited liability or limited LLC, has to indicate to the public that this is an actual entity and this is what, kind of structure it is. In that document, there's going to be effective dates. So in Ohio in particular, they allow for your effective date to be up to 90 days from the date that you're actually filing the document. So and you definitely want to double check that. Even with Ohio, you just want to double check and work with your counsel to make sure that that date is correct based on when the business or the company is launched. Period of existence. You don't necessarily have to have a period of existence in the documents. That is an optional category. So you might find some companies leave that blank. Purpose, same goes for purpose. You want to make, now old school trends, there used to be a time where the purpose of a company was always indicated on the documents. It was always there, but not as much now. But you definitely want to make sure that you're working with your counsel to determine whether or not you want to include that there. For many companies, the best practice is just to say, you plan to engage in legal business activities, right? It tends to be a very broad definition there. There are some liability reasons as to why, but we won't dig down into all of those specifics. Really just know that that is an optional category in that filing process. Now, one of the other items that is not optional, you need to appoint a statutory agent. So that is the party that receives notification when, unfortunately, you're being sued. So you definitely have to have some kind of contact for a service of process in the event that that occurs. So for you that may or may not know, one of the most successful startup companies, very major acquisition that took place in Midwest Ohio, in the Midwest, within the last, I believe, 5 years, if I remember correctly, is Cover My Meds. This is an example of an Articles of Organization for a company. So this is kind of the document that you would take with you to a bank. This is what they want to see when they're looking to establish a bank account. So I just wanted to give an example of what that document would look like, what you're looking for there. All right, so the other item, so I said there were two major documents that with a limited liability company you want to have drafted and developed in the beginning stages of forming the company. The operating agreement is that second document. Now you will work with your legal counsel to draft that document. And it's going to cover, so I've identified some 4 key areas here that are included in that operating agreement. One big category is governance. How does your company operate? How will your board members be elected? What kind of power do they have? Your board composition. So it really just gives some insight as to the rules of how you and your internal, constituents will govern and run the company. Membership interests. So this here really looks at the different classes of interest that you're going to offer. So sometimes, for example, when you are working with, say, independent contractors in lieu of formal compensation, you may offer to them shares of stock or fractions of shares, or I should say interest, because we're talking about a limited liability company here, but shares of interest and units of shares in the company. You may even structure your compensation with that independent contractor such that as they work, they earn their units. So again, a conversation for you to have with your legal counsel, but your membership interest will be covered in that operating agreement. So you have classes of interest, how it's allocated, how it's distributed, what the limitations on, an equity owner's ability or membership, a member, as they call it for limited liability companies, a member's ability to be able to sell those units. So what that process looks like. Confidentiality, you definitely want to have in an operating agreement, you're going to have some clauses that really lay out what confidentiality looks like for all of the members, for the people that are working for you. So again, just providing you with some kind of governance for the limited liability company and how you will operate. And then you'll have some other general provisions that you include in that document. Oh, just as a heads up, you do not have to file your operating agreement. Some companies do, but it's not required. Your attorney, as you're working with them, would help you determine if that makes sense. So some of the advantages and disadvantages. With the limited liability company, there is a separation between the members and the business. So that's definitely different than the sole proprietorship, as we mentioned. There was no separation there. With the limited liability company, there is. It's easier to raise investment funding. You have an entity in which the investors can, invest in. Loose formalities with the limited liability company, and you will see as we talk about the corporations. With a limited liability company, there's really not as much formalities when it comes to the number of directors and number of meetings. And so we'll see later that corporations do have those requirements in order for that entity to be recognized. Flow through tax treatment. So it's an attractive benefit to investors who want to use startup losses as a way to offset their profits. You'll see that joint ventures will often involve the temporary creation of a limited liability company for a specific purpose. Maybe it's for a specific transaction. You'll see that a lot. In my experience before, I've seen it a lot being the limited liability companies being created, say, during the development of a movie project. So in the entertainment world, they do use the limited liability companies a lot when a movie is being produced. And so that is very common. Also, individual investors, such as friends and families, might want to also take advantage of that entity. Disadvantages. So a limited liability company recognized when the company is not treated as a separate entity. That's extremely important, and you can have that conversation with your legal counsel, because if you act like the legal entity doesn't exist, if you're in a situation, especially in a legal any kind of litigation, they're going to treat it accordingly. And so you definitely want to make sure that there's a separation there. There's separate bank accounts. There's some kind of formalities that you as a company observes, simply to make sure that there's a clear distinction between yourself as an individual and the entity. So members must assume responsibility for their share of the LLC's income. So that's another, disadvantage to that entity type. All right, so process for creating a limited liability company. As I mentioned, there is a fee. You go online, it's $125. You also want to make sure that you designate your members and you draft your operating agreement, as it was mentioned. If you are the only person operating an LLC, then you wouldn't necessarily have an operating agreement. You would have what's called a declarations of affairs that will also be drafted by your legal counsel. So corporation. A corporation is a legal corporation in which owners, shareholders are taxed separately from the entity. So this is where you get the greatest separation between the shareholders and the actual company. So what are the purpose of articles of incorporation? So unlike with the LLC, you have articles of incorporation for a corporation. That document, similar to the articles of organization, will really be your constitution. It lays out the company's name, where it's located, the number of authorized shares, and something called par value. As I said, work with your attorney to make sure that you kind of understand what that means. Your initial stated capital, so that's the money that's going in, the first round of capital that's actually put into the company. You're going to have a designated agent for service of process. So as I mentioned, someone that's going to be responsible for if, you have to be served, that would be your contact for that. And then corporate purpose, as I mentioned before, you find today that there's either that's left blank a lot of times, but it can be more generic, and you'll find that your attorney will probably recommend you have something listed on the articles of incorporation, legal business activities. It's pretty broad. All right, so with a corporation, unlike the other entities that we talked about, you're going to have bylaws. So the purpose of the bylaws are kind of your series of rules, policies, and processes that govern how the corporation will operate. So as I mentioned, this will be similar to some of the things that you might find in an operating agreement for a limited liability company. But the topics that are covered: your organization's name, your election and voting processes for your board of directors, your meeting processes, when you will meet, how often you will meet, how are decisions made. So this is something that's very important. Laying out right from the very beginning, how are decisions made for this company? How will we determine whether or not the company is sold or shares are sold or there's a merger, with the company? Those details are laid out in your bylaws. Officer duties, and then also amendment of bylaws. So you need to lay out what are the rules for how you actually change the bylaws. Advantages of C corporations, 3 of the major advantages that we'll talk about here: greatest liability protection, as I mentioned, for shareholders and officers. What that means is that, there's some kind of protection if in the event of any kind of liability issues, if the company is sued, that there's a barrier between the, shareholders and the officers and that person's ability to reach the personal assets of the shareholders and officers. So I listed here, there are some separation, or there are some exceptions there. Where the exceptions come in is if you're not treating or observing the formalities of the company, then, if you're in a litigation situation, the courts can treat it as though you're not treating this entity as it's separate from yourself. So if the company is undercapitalized, if the company's funds were commingled with personal funds, if the corporate books were not kept separately, or if corporate actions are not authorized. So again, as we talked about bylaws, how decisions are made. Are you actually observing those practices to keep and really observe the formalities of that company? The second advantage would be venture investors. They prefer C corporations. So major investors, they want to see corporations. You also get the benefit of creating preferred stocks. So there's different stock classes that you'll identify also laid out in your articles of incorporation. That's where you will determine, different classes of stock. And then IPOs. If your company was ever eligible for IPO, that entity is preferred. So disadvantages: you have some operational formalities. Obviously, as I discussed, if you're not treating it as a separate entity, it will not be treated as a separate entity. A second big one that you hear a lot about is double taxation. So the idea that, the company is taxed and then you're taxed on, your gains as, an investor. One of the kind of the nuances, or I would say an asterisk to that, is that typically with, corporations, the money that is generated is reinvested back into the company. So it's not actually paid out in dividends. So if it is paid out in dividends, then obviously you do have, tax implications. One of the other kind of that asterisk there is in the event of a sale of shares or a merger, there's no double taxation issues. Again, I encourage, for deep dive questions into this, absolutely speak with your legal counsel around those questions. So the formal filing process here, $125 fee. You establish the company and you authorize the equity. For C corporations, you do have to have at least 3 directors. You want to designate your initial officers. So as I mentioned, with limited liability companies, you don't have those rules, those same rules. With C corporations, you need, at least for the state of Ohio, a president, secretary, and treasurer. You want to make sure that you are clear. Again, if you are a person that is in a different state, you want to make sure that you're working with your legal counsel in that state to help you understand what those requirements are for that state around, officers. And then you adopt a code of regulations. Again, it's bylaws. S corporations. So some of the advantages for, S corporations, shareholders of S corporations report the flow through of income and losses on their personal tax returns and are assessed tax at individual income tax rates. The other item is that it allows S corporations to avoid the double taxation issue. So it can be appealing from that perspective. Disadvantages, S corporations are responsible for taxes on certain built-in gains and passive income. Again, it gets very technical, and that's why I encourage you to ask deeper questions with your counsel. So the last category that we will cover today, and again, I want to make sure that I leave time for questions, are partnerships. So I've identified the 3 different categories of partnerships that are most talked about. You have your general partnerships, limited liability partnership, and limited liability partnerships. Hopefully I didn't repeat myself there. Okay, so for general partnerships, a general partnership is an association of 2 or more people that agree to carry on business as co-owners for profit. Each person contributes money, property, labor, skills, and shares in the profits and losses of the business. So everybody puts in, everybody shares in the losses as well. So some of the advantages to forming a general partnership, there's no required filings, at least, and again, this is in the context of Ohio, no required filings. However, you may file what's called a statement of partnership authority, which can be useful in litigation. A partnership can be formed upon agreements of the parties, and really what governs the relationship within a general partnership. So that means how partners interface with one another, their expectations, duties, limitations on their authority is really governed by their partnership agreement. However, you don't necessarily have to have a partnership agreement in order for a general partnership to have been formed. So you have to be very careful when you're working with people and you're making certain agreements, or you start to engage in business together. There are times when, just the engagement without the formal agreement can actually result in the creation of a partnership, and you didn't even intend to do so. So you want to be careful there. Disadvantages to general partnership is the big one is personal liability. So all partners are personally responsible for the liabilities of the partnership. That means your personal assets, everything that you own, those things are fair game in the event of any kind of litigation or someone, attempting to sue you for, whatever reason, some failure with the company, there's no separation there. Limited partnerships. So limited partnerships is also an association of 2 or more. I want to get down into what is the difference between the general partnership and the limited partnership. So with a general partnership, as we said, everyone puts in money, everyone puts in skilled labor, everyone shares in losses together. They're actively all engaged in the company. With a limited partnership, though, only the general partner has managerial control, and they have the ability to bind the partnership as an agent. They're also joint and severally liable for partnership debts. Then there's also going to be limited partners that would be engaged, but limited partners, they are only liable up to the extent of their investment. So they have no managerial control over the partnership itself. And again, you want to speak with legal counsel to really discuss what that looks like, for your business if you choose that entity as your, business entity of choice. So some of the advantages to a limited liability partnership would be the liability is segmented across both, as I mentioned, general partnership and a limited partner. So general partners are the ones that take the burden of the responsibility in those relationships. So they have managerial control, as I mentioned, and the ability to bind the partnership as an agent. That means they can go out on behalf and act on behalf and commit the partnership business or commit the actual business to engagements, whether it's contracts or debts. That can be incurred. They have the power to do that. Limited partners, they have the benefit of really limiting their, liability in that situation. So they are only responsible up to the amount of money that they actually put in the first place. So your disadvantages, again, I'm doing good on time. We're going to be able to wrap up all of these slides here. All right, so disadvantages to the limited partnership would be general partners are jointly and severally liable for partnership debt. So as I mentioned, they take a lot of the risk. Limited partners, they have no managerial control over the partnership, which could probably be problematic if you, let's say, have great, issue or you take with great issue with some of the actions that the general partner is taking. Limited liability partnerships. So in this, with this partnership entity, each partner has managerial control and the ability to bind partnership as an agent. So it's more of a shared control here. That can be appealing because, a partner liability is limited to the amount of their investment. So everyone gets to take advantage of that. It allows for partners to have more control. So everyone has active ownership. They're not limited, say, for example, with a limited partner in a limited partnership entity. They have equal control. They have limited liability. And it's better than, as I said, it's better than the limited partnerships or general partnerships where at least one partner has unlimited liability. The disadvantage would be, filing requirements. So with this partnership, this entity type, the parties are required to file a statement of qualification with the Ohio Secretary of State. Again, you want to make sure you're working with your counsel to check your state guidelines around that. They also have biennial filing requirements as well in order to maintain the partnership's authorization to do business. So that's a nuance that's different as well. So we've come to the end of the details around the different characteristics of these different entities. Just wanted to give some kind of examples of what it looks like when you go onto the website to actually create the entities that we discussed. So you go to your Ohio business filing, and I'm actually going to pull this up here. I'm going to pull this up so that you can actually see. All right, so you will, if you're doing it yourself, chances are, as I said, please consult with your counsel. Your counsel will actually go to the Ohio Secretary of State page, and this is where they would start the process of filing those documents. So here, you would click on submit a business filing. I'm not going to take you through that process, but it will prompt you to actually create an online filing, an online profile. And that's where you'll be able to navigate, that process of filing the documents. Let's see here. Let me pull back up presentation. All right, so as I mentioned, so once you get past, and I did give a screenshot of what it looks like once you're in it. So once you have a profile, you will come to a page where it gives you the option to file a new business or register name. The next page will actually, again, I want to make sure I leave time for questions. It'll take you to this page where you will choose which type of entity you want to file. So if you can see here really closely, you have all the different fees here. Okay, it looks like, and even with that, I'll make sure that before we send out the presentation, make sure that we update some of these pricing here. So $99, I see it's a different price. So I'll make sure that we update that in the presentation. But it looks like $99 for a limited liability company. You'll have different prices depending on the entity. This next page is where earlier in the presentation, I spoke about making sure that you're searching to see if your name, the company name, is actually available. So it will prompt you to do that before you're even able to move forward with the filing. Now, I circled this, I highlighted this part here because it is important to understand that, just doing a general search is not the end all be all. Even if your name does not come up as, a registered mark for the state, your registration is not really approved until the entire filing process has been completed. So just want to keep that in mind. They put that warning there while you're going through that process. So I also have here a share of the articles of organization for a limited liability. So what it actually looks like when you get into a limited liability filing. So you'll start the formation of that articles of organization. Just wanted to give you here an example. So we have Procter & Gamble. Once all of your articles of incorporation or articles of organization, depending on what entity you file, has been completed, when you search your business name on the business search of the Ohio Secretary of State, you will see, now obviously in this example, we have Procter & Gamble, but you'll see your company name come up and it'll have a list of information. You'll actually be able to click on show details, and you'll be able to always have access to your articles of organization. And any other filings that you make, that is actually public record and accessible. So I know that was a lot of information. It was sharing a lot, but hopefully, it was enough to give you a high level overview, some general talking points to have with your legal counsel. Of course, I encourage you to have those conversations. I also want to share the resources that CASE has. So of course, some of you may or may not be familiar with the Sears Think Box. I know right now in times of COVID, we haven't, been able to, it hasn't been accessible the way it normally is. Hopefully that changes soon. But the Think Box is the makerspace on campus. It is an amazing, again, when things open back up, if you have an opportunity to just tour what they're doing over there, it's an absolute amazing space. It's actually, I won't say the first of its kind on a college campus, but I would say it's one of the very well-known maker spaces in the region, I would say. And I would argue just one of the top. So definitely a place for founders if you want to explore that your company is going to center around and you're looking to develop a prototype or some kind of, physical item. Definitely encourage you to reach out to those folks over there. They're doing some really great work and really supporting innovation, not only just on campus, but just regionally. So I did include their information, so please reach out to them. So shameless plug here for the IP Venture Clinic. Of course, I'm an alumni of the Venture Clinic, and we did some really, really great work through partnerships with these various organizations here, and I have included them there. I also happen to actually be the advocate for LaunchNet, which is focused around the networking and support of entrepreneurs on collegiate campuses. So you'll see LaunchNet, you'll hear that out there if you're plugged into the space. But the IV Venture Clinic, it actually provides free, given you meet the requirements, free legal support for startups and founders. Now, again, you have to go through the process to make sure that you are eligible, but it is an amazing, very discounted, I would say. You can't get any more discount but the work that they're doing there is so substantively important and quality. It's led by some really great practitioners over there. So I definitely encourage you, if you're at the stage where you actually are, looking to get started with your company, reach out to them. They do have an intake number. It's listed down here at the bottom. So reach out to them and, have a conversation, and you could possibly end up having legal representation, corporate legal representation that can do a number of work, whether it's transactions, whether it's preparing you for investment conversations, or even taking you through, a patentability analysis and filing a patent application or, a trademark application. That's some of what I did when I was there. So that would bring me to the end. Hopefully I left a few minutes here for questions. I was rolling through there really fast, but like I said, please feel free to reach out. On this final slide here, this is the information for the Veale Institute. I'm sure, if you found out about this, you probably already know about the Veale Institute, but just to kind plug us in there. Group very amazing practitioners that have a number of years of experience, across industry experience, across the board. Our EIRs, the internal leadership team, the interns have been absolutely amazing. So I encourage people to reach out, if you have an innovation that you're working with, whether you're, an alumni, student, or faculty, please reach out at that number below. So do we have questions? Let's see here. Looking over in the chat. I don't know, Doug, if I don't see any questions here. So I must have done an amazing job of running through that information really fast. Please feel free to post questions there in the chat if you do have any. And as we mentioned, we will, we can send out the deck, and I'll make sure those updates on prices is in there. But send out the deck if you're interested in getting that. Does anybody
There's
have
actually one question from Jessica that she just posted.
Right. Hi, Jessica.
Hello.
Jessica, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So my question is about the different types of corporate entities. Seems to me like, depending on the stage that your company is at, one type may be better than another. And as your idea moves forward, then you may want to go from a limited liability company to a C corporation. So is it possible to upgrade?
Absolutely. And what they call that, the department, and if I was all the way in the profile, you would actually be able to see that. So what they call that from the business filing perspective is a conversion. So you would be converting your limited liability company into a C corporation. And that absolutely is possible at time. I actually had a couple of clients that did that when I was in the IP venture clinic. So yes, that is possible. The closer that you get to, say, certain types of investors, you will find that conversion happens. So the short answer is yes, you can convert that form. You do it by another filing that takes place in the same location, in the same space of the Ohio Secretary of State website. You would work with your legal counsel to go through that process. They can take care of that for you. And then they can also, again, detail in more or be more specific about, some of the pros and cons and the advantages and disadvantages of doing that. So yes, short answer, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it looks like we have a question from Carl as well. Carl, if you want to unmute and ask it. Oh, actually. Carl, are you there?
Hello. I just wrote it down, but can you please explain a little bit more about angel investors, the different kinds of investors you had in one of your first slides?
Yes. So, and I'm sorry, I didn't hear the very last part of what you said. You said, just explain a little bit about angel investors.
You described a few investors in one of your slides. I missed the part about angel investors. Could you expand about that a little bit more, please? Sure.
Yes. So with angel investors, and you might hear, even though it's incorrect, you might hear people use the terms angel investor and venture capital firms interchangeably. They're not the same. With venture firms, when they are investing in you, they're investing from an actual fund that is created and they have a set term that they are looking to produce certain yields from the fund that they are investing in. Angel investors are not as restricted. So they can have funds, but they don't necessarily have the same fund restrictions as you'll see with a venture capital firm. There's additional details around that, but and actually, so one of the things, and you guys can keep a lookout for that, this is actually one of the topics that I want to dig down a little bit more into in another workshop session. But yes, so angel investors have a little less of the restrictions that a venture fund a venture capital firm may have, even if they are investing out of, say, a grouping of investments. So it's just different priorities, and you might find that it's harder to get VC funds, depending on what that fund's specialty is and how they've packaged, their portfolio. It might sometimes be easier to get funds from an angel investment fund versus, a VC fund. So just to share a little bit about that, but I will be following up. Definitely keep an eye out on some more details around that as well. Oh, and also feel free to reach out, and have that conversation with a lot of the great resources that are there at CASE as well.
Any other questions?
Yeah, any other questions?
I had a question. This is Elizabeth. I was just wondering if the company name ends in Inc., does that tell you it's a C Corp or an S Corp?
Yes, so C Corp.
Okay, that's specific to that. Okay.
Yeah.
And then it looks like Jessica posted one last question in the chat about tax rates. Jessica, if you want to ask it.
All right, Jessica. So we have a question around different types of corporate entities have different tax rates. Is there a financial advantage in terms of overall taxation to starting with a specific corporate tax? Okay, so now what I will say, I will preface this by saying, one, I am not a tax expert. That gets into more of the specifics that you want to work with a tax professional counsel on. What I will say from a very general perspective is that, yes, different corporate entities have different tax implications. So meaning, for example, if you have a sole proprietorship, how that's the income that you have, how the IRS will tax that income versus if you have a limited liability company, you're paying taxes after your costs. So it's a little bit different in terms of how that's structured. And then with a corporation, there's even more detail. So that's a really big question that level of specialty would need to be directed to someone in that space. But definitely that's a great question, but you need to work with a tax professional that can talk about the specific nuances around that. So sorry.
So just a follow-up question on that. Yeah, that clarified a lot. So from the presentation, it seemed like if you're starting a company, it would really be advantageous to start with an LLC, because it seems like in terms of taxation, at least, like you said, taxation will happen after your costs. So in that regard, it seems like starting with an LLC would be the way to go. But then in terms of attracting investors, it seems like it would be advantageous to have a C Corp, because that gives them more protection. And it seems to be more attractive to them. So perhaps the way to go would be to start with an LLC, and as soon as you are at a point where you may be more interesting to investors, then perhaps prepare a transition to a C Corp then.
Yeah, and you came to the same conclusion that many people do. A lot of times the limited liability company is the quote unquote easiest, because it does allow you, less of the restrictions that come with a C corporation. As I mentioned in the presentation, you have formalities, your annual meetings, you have to keep separate record books. There's a lot more control there. But it really, I will say this, that doesn't mean that you won't have investors that would invest in a limited liability company, because, depending on the type of investor you're targeting, the type of investor can impact whether or not that entity structure, is of top priority. Because I've actually seen, so as an example, when I was in the IP Venture Clinic, I worked with a client who started off in an LLC, and the bulk of his investment actually happened before he converted. So I know that we're actually a few minutes over time, but again, please feel free to reach out to any of the resources on campus, and hopefully this has been a valuable experience to you all. Thank you so much. And I did include my LinkedIn profile in case you want to connect on LinkedIn as well. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Starlyn. This concludes our programming for the fall semester, and we'll be scheduling programming for the spring. So if you just want to visit our website, we'll be getting that posted as soon as we confirm. And as always, have a happy holiday season and Happy New Year if I don't see you before. Thank you.
Happy New Year, everyone.